All right. Tonight we have the honor of Gary Sinise, and before we do, I need to introduce, you can all go ahead and sit down now. I'm going to introduce my friend John Highbush, who is the executive director of the Ronald Reagan Foundation and Library. He is the reason why Mr. Gary Sinise is here tonight. They're basically neighbors out there in California and friends, and they share a like-mindedness in the vision and values of our country. And so I asked John if he could somehow pull in Mr. Sinise for this night. So it's his fault that he's here. It's his responsibility he's here. So let's give him a big thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to him now.
Thanks so much, Scott. And Jerry, thank you so much for allowing me to bring out one of the most decent and generous and patriotic Americans that walk this earth today, Gary Sinise. This is a big deal for Gary and I. We've brought a number of slides, some photographs that it'd be kind of a neat show and tell that connect very, very much to Gary's brand new New York Times bestseller. And it's a bit of a walk down memory lane. And we left the Reagan Library just last night and flew in right after the event, a packed crowd. A lot of incredibly patriotic Americans, just like those that I am looking at this evening. So with that, if I could ask my friends here to put up the very first slide. Here's Gary's book. This one is really, really worth your reading. It is an American tale. It's a classic. And I really encourage you to take a look at it. It might change your life. If we could, we'll go to the next slide. Here we go. Gary, let me ask you a question. Which of these young gentlemen might be Gary Sinise?
All right, that's me in the red shirt. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you, and thanks for having me. So, is it still there? Yeah. So the reason John wanted to put this picture up is because so much of what my performing life, it began with music. And I had my first guitar when I was in 4th grade and started playing. And this is a very well-attended, large crowd in the backyard of my house in Highland Park, Illinois. And folks from Illinois here, that's good. That's why I grew up the north side. I was born on the south side of Chicago, moved to the north side, went to school in Highland Park, Illinois. This is where I got my first guitar, started playing. That's me in the penny loafers and white socks there with the red shirt. We had, and my dad took this picture, and I put it in my book because so much of what I'm doing right now includes music. And music kind of led me to, music actually led me to acting. Because years later, I guess I'm about 6th grade here. Years later, I'm a sophomore in high school. I was a struggling student, from the time I was in kindergarten through all the way through high school. And I was kind of in trouble. And music was the only thing that kept me kind of busy and kept me interested. And I was standing in a hallway in my high school as a sophomore, and I was standing, probably cutting class. I was just not a good guy, a good student at that time. I was a good guy, but just not a good student. And I was standing in this hallway, and this little lady just blew down the hallway. She was like a fireball. And do you know the musical West Side Story? So West Side, there it is. That West Side Story is about, these two gangs, the American gang, the Puerto Rican gang, and they kind of fight each other, and then they come together at the end. She blew down the hallway and then turned to me and looked at me standing with my band members and said, "I'm directing West Side Story. You look perfect for the gang members. Please come and audition for the show." And then she blew off down the hall. And this is just a chance encounter. I just happened to be cutting class and standing in that hallway at this moment, but it was a life-changing thing because I ended up kind of taking her up on it. I went to the audition, and they handed me a script. First, I wasn't sure if I was going to go in there, but I saw all the pretty girls going in, so I followed them in there. And they handed me a script. I didn't know what I was doing, and I started to read the script, and I was stumbling through it and making jokes and cracking everybody up, and she put me in the play and gave me a 2-line part. I think it was a very small part. And this is the original program from the play in 1971, and it completely changed my whole life. I fell in love with acting. Now I wanted to take all the theater classes. I wanted to come to school and be in all the plays. And I found this purpose that I would carry into my career years later. And obviously I've been doing it since I was 16 years old.
Can we go to the next slide? Now, Gary, I thought Steppenwolf was a band. What is this about?
So this is 1976, and I graduated from high school, and I didn't go to college, and I wanted to continue that feeling that we had of doing plays in high school. So we got some kids together, and we started a theater company. And we called it Steppenwolf because somebody happened to be reading the book called Steppenwolf, and we needed to put something on the program, so we called it Steppenwolf. And this is 1976. This is our first sign. We were able to get, there was a Catholic school that had closed down, and there was a basement in this Catholic school, and it was a big room. And I went to the priest and I asked him if we could use that room to build a theater, and he said yes. And he gave us the room for like $1 a year. And we went in there, we built an 88-seat theater. My high school buddy, Jeff Perry, has anyone seen the show Scandal? Scandal fans there. Jeff plays the evil chief of staff on Scandal, and he's my best buddy from high school. He was in the production of West Side Story. We started the theater company together. He went to Illinois State University, and that's where he met John Malkovich and actress named Laurie Metcalf, who's done superbly well, really well.
Well, let's go to the next slide.
A great group of people. There's a bunch of people from Steppenwolf right there. That's Laurie Metcalf on the bottom right. Jeff Perry behind her. That's me in the white shirt with the glasses there. And behind me is my wife, Moira. Up top is Malkovich, and next to him is an actress named Glenn Headley, who unfortunately passed away. On the left, remember Frasier? Remember John Mahoney? He played Frasier's dad. That's John Mahoney behind the woman in the white shirt there. And the woman in the right shirt there is Joan Allen. She's a very well-known actress, nominated for 3 Academy Awards. Great group of people here, and this is the original company of Steppenwolf.
Well, speaking of Malkovich, can we go to the next slide?
Okay, you know who John Malkovich is? Do you know? Okay, so that's him with me. And this is the play that we did called True West. It's one of the first shows that we moved to New York from Chicago. And Malkovich and I were in it. Nobody knew who we were. We took it to New York in 1982. It was a big hit. It ended up playing a significant role in Steppenwolf's evolution as a company. And by the way, Steppenwolf went from this basement of a Catholic school where no one made any money. I was 18 years old when it started. It's now been around 45 years. We own 3 buildings there. We built 2 of them from the ground up, bought the other 2, renovated them. Really, is a wonderful American dream story. In the beginning, we all worked jobs during the day. I worked on a loading dock at Neiman Marcus, unpacking boxes and pulling them off trucks. Malkovich drove a school bus. Do you know who John Malkovich is? Don't you fear for those children that he was driving? I often wonder if they turned out all right, those children. That was John's day job, and we all had day jobs, and we worked to support ourselves while we did the theater at night. Now the theater company has over 50 actors, writers, directors, artists that are involved in it, and again, it's a internationally recognized theater company, and there's a lot in my book about this, the importance of this stuff to how I would eventually move into the television and movie business.
Well, speaking of important stuff, this next slide, I believe, Gary, this production really changed your life.
So I have a lot of veterans in my family. And where are all our veterans out here? Can we have all our veterans stand up and be recognized by the audience here? And anyone who served our country. How many Vietnam veterans do we have in the audience today? Welcome home to all our Vietnam veterans. God bless you. So I have Vietnam veterans in my family. On my wife's side of the family, I have World War I. My grandfather served during the Battle of the Argonne in France, 1917, 1918. He had 3 sons. 2 of them served in World War II, one on a ship in the Pacific, the other a navigator on a B-17 bomber over Europe. My dad served in the Navy in the early 50s. On my wife's side of the family, her 2 brothers served in Vietnam, one as a combat assault helicopter pilot, 800 combat hours. The other, a West Point graduate, went as a platoon leader, a lieutenant, and then went back again as a company commander, a captain. Then he went to West Point, taught as a major there. He was teaching at Fort Leavenworth as a lieutenant colonel in the early 80s. He was diagnosed with cancer and unfortunately passed away in 1983. I got to know these Vietnam veterans very, very closely in my family, and they really, I think even more so than the veterans in my own family, the Vietnam veterans on my wife's side of the family were the ones that really awakened something in me as a young person. I was an 18-year-old high school kid in 1973 when combat operations ended in Vietnam. And during the Vietnam War, I remember very specifically the nightly news broadcasts of casualty reports and what was going on in Vietnam. But I was caught up with playing music. I was caught up with doing theater. I was caught up with just being a high school kid. And, you know, it wasn't until I really met the Vietnam veterans in my wife's family that I thought back to those days and how oblivious I was to what was going on with guys that just were folks that were just a little older than I was, serving in the jungles of South Vietnam while I was being a kid in high school. And so I started thinking, and I felt very guilty about having been so oblivious during that time. And I wanted to do something. And as the artistic director of Steppenwolf back in the late 70s, early 80s, one of the things that you do as artistic director is you look for plays for the people in your company to be in, and you're putting plays on stage. So as a director, I very much wanted to find a piece of material that told the stories of our Vietnam veterans. And so I looked in newspapers from all around the country to see what they were doing in those cities. And I found this play that was being performed in 1980, and it was called Tracers. And it had been conceived by a Vietnam veteran who had done some work in the theater, and he wanted to bring Vietnam veterans together to kind of workshop a play based on their experiences in Vietnam. So he brought them together, and they wrote this play, and only 2 of them had been on stage before. The rest were just veterans, and they were performing their stories on stage 8 times a week, every night in Los Angeles. So I flew out there to see the play, and it was very powerful. And I went back the next night and saw it again, and then I started begging them to let me produce it in Chicago. They felt that it should never be done by anyone other than veterans. So they said no. And then it closed in Los Angeles, and I kept bugging them. Why don't you let me do it? Why don't you let me do it? Finally, they said okay. And so we produced this play, and in preparation for producing this play, we did a lot of research. We went to the VA in North Chicago. We went to the VA in North Chicago, and we sat with groups of Vietnam veterans that were struggling with post-traumatic stress at the VA, and we listened to them talk. And they told us, they shared their stories of serving in Vietnam. It was a galvanizing moment for my cast. And so we went and produced this play. The word got out in Chicago, and this is the early 80s. So the wall had just opened up in 1982, but Vietnam veterans were still, they were still reluctant to, you know, come together. And I mean, it was a terrible time for our veterans coming home from Vietnam, as you well know, our Vietnam veterans, because the country had been so divided over the war, and the Vietnam veteran kind of felt the sting of that. And it was a shameful period in our history where our veterans were not treated well when they came home from war. But I wanted to honor them in some way by telling their stories on stage. And the word got out around Chicago that this was happening at Steppenwolf, and so veterans from all over the city were coming to see the play. So we made one performance a week, just Veterans Night, and we would have 200 veterans in the audience every night, and we let them in for free. And it became this healing, powerful, cathartic thing in Chicago, and it was very moving to me to be a part of this. And so from that experience, I started working locally to support local Vietnam veterans in Chicago, supporting them throughout the 80s, and then along came the 90s, and I got to play one.
Next slide, please. Boy, this is famous. this changed your life as well.
Yes, so 10 years later, after I did that play, we had moved out to Los Angeles, and I was trying to get acting work. I produced a film of Mice and Men, the John Steinbeck novel. And some Mice and Men fans out there. Great. Thank you. And I think that got the attention of the producers and the director of Forrest Gump, because they called and asked me to come in and audition for this part. And I read it, and it was a Vietnam veteran. And having been involved with supporting Vietnam veterans in Chicago and working with them in different ways, I was just so eager to play this part. And I went in and auditioned for it. And then I didn't hear anything for about 3 weeks or so. And, you know, as an actor, any actors here? Any people in the theater departments out here? So as an actor, you kind of learn after a while that you shouldn't hang everything on one audition. You got to just keep going, and you hope that they work, but keep going. And I learned to do that. And when I didn't hear anything back on Forrest Gump, I just went on and auditioned for other things. I auditioned for a movie called Little Buddha that Keanu Reeves was in. And anybody see Little Buddha in here? You're the only one, man. You saw it. Great. Great. I mean, so how many people saw Forrest Gump? So good thing I didn't get Little Buddha, clearly, and then I got this one. I screen tested for Little Buddha. It was between me and Chris Isaak. You know Chris Isaak? He's the rockabilly guitar player, country guy, and Chris auditioned for it. He got the part. Luckily, I didn't get the part because I may have taken it because I needed work, and I got this part instead, and it turned the whole career into a different direction. From that point on, I started supporting our wounded through the DAV, Disabled American Veterans Organization. They invited me. You know, Forrest Gump is 25 years old this year. And 25 years ago, they invited me to the DAV invited me to their national convention. I document all this in the book. It was a very powerful moment. They invited me to come on stage. There was 2,500 wounded veterans in the audience. They were all cheering. They wanted to give me an award for playing the wounded veteran, and it changed my life in more ways than one.
Next slide. Now, this is quite a different role. And I think I remember, Gary, I think you told me once that this is one of your most favorite roles that you played.
Yeah, so that's Harry Truman. I got to play Harry Truman for HBO in an HBO film. It did very, very well. In fact, I went to the Oscars for Forrest Gump, and the day after the Oscars, I got on a plane and went to Kansas City and started shooting this. President Harry Truman. It was based on a book by David McCullough. That is a full plastic silicone gel face. That it went from here to here. It was just a completely fake face to make me look old like Harry Truman. And I would sit in the makeup chair for 4.5 hours in the morning, and then we'd shoot for 12 or 13 hours. I mean, it was a really long day. But it was worth it because the movie did really well on HBO. It won a bunch of awards. I won some awards for that. And it led to other things. You know, you're always hoping that you get the next big part, and that would just keep the momentum going. And this one certainly did that.
Now, you went to Broadway as well, I think. Next slide. Here's an interesting shot.
Anybody have any idea what this might be? What? You're right. It's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I was always a big fan of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest from the time I was a kid. I saw it as a kid, as a young actor. I was at the world premiere of the movie that Jack Nicholson was in. I was just a big fan of it. And in the back of my mind, over the years, I'd always hoped to play that part. So this is, how many people saw the movie of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with Jack Nicholson? So do you remember the chief? Well, the chief was a guy named Will Sampson. That's his son, Tim Sampson, in our production of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And we did it in Chicago, then we moved it to London, and then we did it on Broadway. And we opened it in April of 2001. We were supposed to close September 16th, 2001. But for a few reasons, we decided to close early, July 29th, 2001.
Next slide. That's you holding the American flag, right?
This is September 14th, 2001. This is 3 days after the attacks of September 11th. I would have been in New York had the play run its full run to September 16th, but now I'm back in California. And we all experienced that terrible day. And President Bush declared that the Friday after the Tuesday of the attacks would be a national day of prayer. And I'm sure you remember churches, places of worship across the country were just filled to the gills. People looking for comfort, looking for hope. We were all filled with a terrible fear that these attacks were going to happen again. Remember anthrax going through the mail all of a sudden within a couple of weeks of the attacks? There was a fear, our hearts were broken. It was just a very difficult time. And so that day, earlier that day, I was in our little church, and it was packed, and I was standing up against the wall and tears running down my face. And I remember just feeling called in some way to, I didn't know what, but that I had to participate in some kind of healing for the country in some way. And this is the candlelight vigil in our neighborhood, and they were happening all over the country. People in the neighborhood were walking down to the corner for the candlelight vigil, and I started to walk there, and then I ran back and I grabbed this flag and I brought it there, and at one point everybody turned to me and they started to recite the Pledge of Allegiance, and everyone was singing patriotic songs, God Bless America, and tears running down our faces, and I just lifted up the flag at that point. Somebody snapped that picture. And there's a chapter in my book called Turning Point. And the book is called Grateful American. I am a grateful American. A journey from self to service. Prior to this moment, I was focused on this singular thing in my life, this acting, directing, the career. But things changed after that event. And I write very specifically what that did and how I turned towards service to heal this broken heart from that terrible day, and it just started to snowball from there.
Well, speaking of turning from self to service, here's where it led you next. Can we see the next slide?
So this is November 2003 in Balad, Iraq, at Balad Air Base. It was called Camp Anaconda. There's about 6,000 troops there. I was there with Wayne Newton, and Chris Isaak was there as well. He was performing. Chris Isaak, I don't know if you know him, but he's the one who got the part in Little Buddha. And I just volunteered to start going out for the USO. I'd already been to Iraq by then. This is my second trip there in 6 months. And I just started volunteering. You know, what can an actor do? You volunteer for the USO, and I wasn't playing music at that time for, you know, on any regular basis. But I just wanted to go. So I just volunteered to go visit with our troops, shake hands, take pictures, sign autographs, have lunch with them, talk to them, make sure that they knew that they were appreciated. And I was fearful at this time that we would deploy our troops to Iraq and Afghanistan and they would not feel appreciated. And having Vietnam veterans in my family, having worked with Vietnam veterans, having met hundreds and hundreds of Vietnam veterans, having talked to them in the hospitals, the thought of our troops coming back after responding to the attacks of September 11th and not feeling appreciated, not feeling welcomed home, that was very troubling to me. And so I just started going out there, and this is my 6th trip in 6 months. I went to Iraq in June of '03. Remember the statue being pulled down? So the statue was pulled down of Saddam Hussein in the square. Our troops tied a chain around it and yanked it down. And I don't know if you remember, the Iraqis, they were hitting the statue, and it was a celebratory time. That happened 2 months before my first trip. I went to Iraq in June of '03. I came back in July. I went to Italy, visited military bases all around Italy. In August, I went to Germany, visited military bases all around Germany. September, I was at Walter Reed in Bethesda for my first time. In fact, I was at Walter Reed and Bethesda on September 11, 2003. I remember very specifically. In October, I was in San Diego visiting troops, and in November, I'm back in Iraq. And this is talking to a bunch of troops in a soccer stadium that Saddam Hussein used to torture people in. And it's a very, you know, this is a very meaningful shot to me because it represents some of the early support that began a whole series of events and journeys along the way.
Now, Gary, then your career as a 6th grade musician comes full circle. Next slide. And this is what? The Lieutenant Dan Band.
So I have a band, if you don't know that. One person does. That's good. Thank you very much. As I said, yeah, I played music all the way through high school and up into my early 20s, and I got very, very busy with the theater company and didn't play, and then picked it up again in the late 90s, and then September 11th happened. And on my first tour, that June '03 tour, I was on a tour with 180 different people on that tour. It was a giant tour. Northwest Airlines gave us a 747. And me and a bunch of entertainers got on that airplane and went over to Iraq. Kid Rock was on that tour. Leanne Womack was on that tour. Robert De Niro even showed up on that tour. I mean, there were basketball players, football players, actors, comedians, cheerleaders. I mean, you name it, rock stars. It was a big tour, and I was watching the musicians kind of entertain. And I had a group of people that I played with for fun, so I just started talking to the USO about letting me take them with me. Finally, in February of '04, they said, okay, I'd been on a bunch of tours myself, and I'd been going over. They saw I was dedicated, so they said, okay, you can take the band. So we set up a tour to Korea, Singapore, and Diego Garcia. That began what has turned into about 450 concerts for the troops around the world. This is just recently. This is at Fort Huachuca in Arizona. The band is, you know, after playing so many concerts for the military, the band's very, very well known within military circles. The band is a program of my foundation, so I have to pay all the musicians, pay the production costs, but we can much like the USO, people donate to the USO, and what's the USO do? It provides entertainment and all kinds of things. So you donate to the Gary Sinise Foundation, and we, among other things, provide morale-boosting entertainment and support for the men and women who serve our country. I play for free, and this is a big concert that we did up there. It's been a lot of concerts over the year. One day maybe you'll hear the band. It's a really fun show.
You've already invited them to play here.
Well, Gary, speaking of morale boosting, this next slide's kind of tough to look at, but it's what it's all about.
So this is Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, and it's one of my trips there. So as I said, I began making regular trips to the hospital starting in 2003. In fact, my first trip to a military hospital to visit our wounded was not in Washington, it was in Germany. On that August trip to Germany, I went to Landstuhl Medical Center, which is, for our military folks, they might know this. Landstuhl is where our service members who are injured, they will go to Landstuhl first from the battlefield in Afghanistan, Iraq, wherever, and they will be stabilized at Landstuhl, and then they will fly home. They'll quite often go to Walter Reed or Bethesda, and now that they're combined now. At the time that I first started visiting, there were two different hospitals in D.C., Walter Reed and Bethesda. There's also Fort Belvoir. This is in San Antonio, and this is where our primary burn unit is. So if you are badly burned, you will go to San Antonio, to BAMC. This Marine had been on a mission in Thailand, actually. He was based in Okinawa, and he was flying a mission in Thailand. His helicopter went down in Thailand. This is in the intensive care unit, and his family asked me to go in and talk to him. He was not aware that I was there. He lost a hand and a leg, and he was badly burned. And the thing that I've experienced over the years with multiple visits to the hospitals many, many times over and over and over is that I can see our wounded in various stages of their recovery. So on my next trip, I went, and he was in a wheelchair. And he met me for really the first time, because here he didn't know I was talking to him there. And the bandages were off. He was in a wheelchair. He was up. He was moving around. The next time I was at BAMC, He was on a prosthetic and moving around, and now he's retired from the Marine Corps, and he's teaching in Michigan, and he's doing very, very well.
So a happy ending. This next slide, Gary, I had the opportunity to once to work for the Red Cross and was assigned to Iraq. And the reason I picked this is because I can tell you're in a medical tent in one of our war zones.
Yes, this is again in Balad in 2007. And he had been badly injured, lost a leg. They were stabilizing him before he was going to be transferred out to Landstuhl. And I was actually visiting a friend of mine who I met on my first band tour to Korea, who was a colonel at the time, F-16 pilot. He was now a brigadier general, and he's running the air wing at Camp Anaconda. And so I went and was making a visit there. And we paid a visit to the hospital. There were many wounded in the hospital being stabilized, and somebody snapped this picture. Unfortunately, I've tried over the years to find out who that was and what happened to him. And in so many, there's been so many trips over the years, multiple trips, and I've got so many pictures with our service members in war zones. And whenever I look at them, I just say a little silent prayer to myself that I hope everyone was okay. Because there have been times when mothers have come up to me with pictures of me with their service member son or daughter, and I can think of 5 or 6 times specifically where they told me it was the last picture taken of their son or daughter as they were killed, very soon after I was there. So when I see pictures of so many of these folks that I've seen over the years, I always pray that they're okay, and I know some of them have returned either wounded or you come home to their final rest. And when you go on these trips, and I'm seeing 2,000 people at once in a 2-hour period, shaking hands, taking pictures very quickly, just giving them that moment, that 20-second moment. You try and give them that 20 seconds and make it seem like 20 minutes, because I get to leave the war zone and they have to stay in the war zone, and you hope they're all right. And God bless our service members. We could never do enough for the men and women who serve our country.
Gary, let's go to, sometimes there's joyous moments too. Next slide.
So quickly, So early in the war, in 2004, after my second trip to Iraq, on my second trip to Iraq, that trip where we were in the soccer stadium, during that trip the troops wanted to show us one of the schools that they had refurbished. And you weren't hearing about all these good news things, and this is prior to the insurgency really ramping up and heating up. But they took us out to an Iraqi school that they had rebuilt, completely rebuilt. Nobody was hearing about these civil affairs projects. But they wanted to show me and Wayne Newton and some of our group. So we went in convoy. It was dangerous, but we went out to the school. And the first impression that I remember was the troops getting out of the Humvees and out of the trucks, and the kids just running up to them and grabbing them and hugging them. And these were the soldiers that had helped to rebuild their school. It was such a joyous, wonderful time. And we went around to all the classrooms, and I remember me and Wayne and Neil McCoy, a great country artist, and Chris Isaac going into one classroom, and the four of us sang "You Are My Sunshine" to the Iraqi kids. They didn't know what we were saying, but they liked it, but I saw all the kids sitting it was very basic. I mean, in our classrooms, you have things on the walls, and there's drawings and ABCs, and there's toys and all kinds of things like that. Nothing on the walls here. All they had was these desks that were kind of long, and you would have 3 or 4 kids sitting at each desk, and they'd be sharing like one little pencil stub. And so I got the idea, hey, when I got home, I went to my children's school and I showed them pictures of my trip, and I said, let's collect a bunch of school supplies and we'll ship them over there. So I shipped we got 25 boxes, shipped them over there, and that began a program that eventually we created called Operation Iraqi Children that we launched in 2004. We started taking in donations. We ended up between 2004 and 2013 shipping hundreds of thousands of school supply kits, pens, paper, pencils, erasers, all these things that the kids don't have over there. We ended up shipping them to Iraq, and then we changed it to Operation International Children because we were shipping to Afghanistan, Djibouti, Haiti, the Philippines, all these different places. Hundreds of thousands of school supplies because we were now taking in donations. People would send us supplies. And this trip, this 2009, around Thanksgiving 2009, I got to take 500 backpacks over to the border, right near the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. That's the schoolhouse. It's a little mud hut. And those are the children. As you can see, some have shoes, some don't. But I got to give them each a backpack filled with school supplies as part of our program, Operation International Children. And I write about Operation International Children in Grateful American. It was a very, very positive program, very positive hearts and minds program. As the convoys would roll into the villages, everybody would be tense. Troops would start handing out stuff. Everything was better.
We're getting near the end here. Next slide. Meanwhile, you had a day job.
Yeah. CSI New York fans out there? So CSI New York came at the perfect time. It came in 2004, right when I was ramping up all kinds of military support. And I didn't have my own foundation at the time. The way I was doing a lot of it was through other organizations, supporting the USO, traveling to play for the troops, visiting hospitals, supporting multiple military charities. Many of them are listed as in this call to action section at the back of my book because they were very, very important in teaching me. I learned so much from working with all these military charities who were operating in all these different spaces, including supporting first responders. And so when I started my own foundation and launched it in 2011, I had a hit TV show going. I had financially, I was doing very well. I could put a lot of my personal money into the creation of the Gary Sinise Foundation. And the chapter in my book about this in relation to my service mission is called Perfect Timing, because the timing couldn't have been better to get this job. I mean, it just came at the right time. CSI New York was on for 9 seasons, and that's 197 episodes. and I owned a little piece of the show. So that helped me create the Gary Sinise Foundation. It allowed me to donate to multiple different military charities, and I've met just extraordinary people serving our country out there trying to help our veterans.
I've watched reruns of that at 11 o'clock at night more times than I can count.
This week, North Korea and all that's happening there is on a lot of people's mind. This next slide we just pulled up because I know that's where you are in this picture.
So I often talk about, while I talk about how important it is to take care of our defenders and to keep them in our prayers and help them when we can, I want people to know why we should do it. These are our freedom providers. They sacrifice for the freedom of the United States and for the freedom of the world. And when you go to places that don't really understand what that is, places like Iraq and Afghanistan, places that have been under the thumb of a dictator, this is the border between North and South Korea, the DMZ. And I often talk about this, and I write about it in my book. I don't think there's a place on earth where you can stand and feel the difference between freedom and slavery any stronger and more powerfully than standing on the DMZ. Because the borderline is only this, it's this big. And it's a small concrete block that just runs down like this. It's about this high. And I can stand on the south side right here, and I could step over to the north side if I wanted to. And on some of these trips that I've made to the DMZ, the North Korean guards will come right down to their side of the border, and they'll be standing 2 feet away from me, just staring at me, taking pictures. And you can look into the eyes of a North Korean this close.
I was there in 1983, and at that time they were digging tunnels under.
Oh yeah, we went down into some of those tunnels.
Yeah.
And there's probably still tunnels that they haven't found. They've found 4 of them. And just imagine how many North Koreans died, in digging those tunnels.
Trying to dig them, yeah.
But you can stand there and stare into the face of a North Korean guard, and that person just has no concept of what freedom is. He was born into slavery. He's still there to serve the supreme leader. He cannot say what he wants. He cannot worship how he wants. He cannot assemble how he wants. He doesn't have a free press. They have none of the things that we so cherish here. But those things have to be fought for and protected. And who has to do that? Our military service members, people that are willing to go and fight for freedom, defend it. So God bless all our defenders for serving our country. We can never do enough for you as far as I'm concerned.
That slide of the hospital tent. Last year, Franklin Graham, who's a good friend, was here, and he does those tents right very close to the battle lines in Iraq, or he did a while back. He set the tents up here on campus, and it's amazing how sophisticated they are, because the nearest hospital is 2-3 hours away. So they bring the soldiers in. A lot of the equipment they have is donated by the military, but they actually man the tents, put the doctors there, the nurses. And you guys probably could strike a great partnership, because that's what he's doing.
Well, yeah, and they're so sophisticated now that 40 years ago, someone in a similar situation to someone who was, we've built homes for many of our wounded. We had 5 quadruple amputees from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We built homes for all of them. Years ago, that person would not have made it. They would have bled to death. But the battlefield medicine and medical things are so different and much more sophisticated now
the-
that they can survive.
These tents are all state of the art, and they do surgery in the tents. They have a recovery room. And but back to Lieutenant Dan, I wanted to mention Tim Lee. He's told his whole story here. After his legs were blown off when he stepped on a landmine in Vietnam, you spent how many months in the hospital? 8 months. And I remember you telling that story, but it seemed like your attitude at that time was very similar to what Lieutenant Dan's attitude, the character's attitude, was in the movie. Is that accurate? I mean, but you were. I don't know.
I was glad to be alive. I wanted to live, you know, and I spent 8 months on a ward. We didn't have private rooms or semi-private rooms. It was a ward with 30, 35 Marines. If you were on Ward 1A at Philadelphia Naval Hospital, you were an amputee, you were a Marine. And I saw a lot of bitterness and anger, but I decided I didn't want to get bitter. I didn't want to get mad.
I thought there was a point a little bit later.
There was a point when I went down to the bottom. I had 2 young doctors that were happy, and they were really doing things they shouldn't have been doing. They were going to do a hip disarticulation and cut off my right hip, which meant I wouldn't be able to set up. I'd have to lay on my stomach backwards. That's like 47 years ago. A lot of things have changed, as Gary said. But my dad stopped them from doing that surgery. It was a godsend. Then on Monday morning, I go to what we Marines call stump rounds, and again, it's all different today, but there's a new doctor there set between the 2 young doctors, ends up being the same doctor, Dr. Robert Bailey, who did the first surgery on me on the USS Sanctuary when they brought me off the battlefield. Yeah. And so it was a God thing. He took me to surgery one time, didn't remove anything, put me on brand new antibiotics, and 2 weeks later I was being discharged from the hospital, and I haven't been back to a hospital for anything directly relating to what happened to me on March the 8th, 1971. So I'm just glad to be alive. I'd like to say one more thing. I know there's some Vietnam veterans sitting out here, and I want to say thank you. I appreciate Gary Sinise. I'm not here to patronize him at all, but what he's doing and others doing as well for these young men and women that have been to Iraq and Afghanistan, there was nothing like that when we came back from Vietnam. We were spat upon, called baby killers, and horrendous bags of urine thrown at us, and nothing. And truth of the matter is, most of us didn't expect anything. We went and did a job, but there's a lot of hatred, a lot of animosity. So I think somebody said, anything good come from Vietnam? Yes, we learned how to treat our men and women who go and pay such a great sacrifice for America.
My point was that you did such a good job with that character, showing what so many men, like when Tim was at his low point, what so many other Vietnam vets went through. I think that was a big part, plus what you're doing now, of making sure that never happens to any veterans coming home again. We appreciate you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our final slide here, you know, what you're doing now, it's the Gary Sinise Foundation. It's what has become the focus of your life.
So yes, having worked with multiple military charities, learned from them, raised money for many of them over the years, it just became clear that this was a part of my life that was going to be with me for a long time. So I started the Gary Sinise Foundation. We have multiple programs at the Gary Sinise Foundation doing a lot of great things. I write about it in the book. You can go to GarySiniseFoundation.org. There are many, many videos on the YouTube channel that show our programs in action, and you can meet the people that we're supporting and that kind of thing. It's been a beautiful mission. It's given my life great purpose and meaning to be able to use the success that I've had in the movie and television business and do some good with it to help somebody else. So I hope that you'll give Grateful American a look, take a look at it, learn a little bit more about how I got to the service mission and the Gary Sinise Foundation. Thank you, everybody, for having me here today.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you.